Hi, everyone. It's a little bit after 4 o'clock in New York. We are back at the table today. We just witnessed President Biden signing a bill making Juneteenth, a commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States, a national holiday. It is the first new national holiday since 1983. The push to make it a holiday gained momentum amid the racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd and culminated with unanimous support in the U.S. Senate and near unanimous support in the House. It was the president's first public event since returning from his trip to Europe, and he returns to Washington with a little bit of wind at his back, thanks to a win handed to him from an unlikely source, the conservative majority U.S. Supreme Court. Yep. You heard that right. In a 7-2 decision, the nation's highest court upheld the Affordable Care Act for a third time, ruling that a group of Republican attorneys general lack standing to sue to strike down the law. For the Biden administration, the court's ruling takes off the table the specter of millions of Americans suddenly losing their health insurance, and what could have been a major setback to the Biden agenda amid what looks like the tail end of a global pandemic and a very quickly recovering economy. And you have to look hard for it, but there is evidence that President Biden's commitment to bipartisan governing is paying off in some small ways for now, and potentially some larger ones. Yes, you still have a creepy symbiotic relationship between Putin's disinformation and the American right. It's designed to harden our divisions. And yes, there is plenty of reason to despair about the voter suppression laws racing through just about every state legislature in this country. But there are also real live signs of bipartisan progress and achievement, including that event we just mentioned and watched, President Biden today signing bipartisan legislation making Juneteenth a U.S. holiday. President Biden today also seeing progress on infrastructure, with more Republicans coming on board a bipartisan $1 trillion plan. And there's progress on bipartisan police reform legislation. Punchbowl News has this reporting that talks between Democratic Senator Cory Booker and Republican Tim Scott are back on track. Some say a deal could be reached by the end of this week. And even the bucket of voting restrictions predicated on the big lie that there was fraud in the 2020 election. Of course, there was no fraud. That wave is seeing its first real threat in the sign of a possible compromise on voting reform drafted by the one and only Joe Manchin, the lone Democratic holdout on that sweeping voting rights legislation. That proposal is attracting the support of leading voting rights activist Stacey Abrams today. Is it all taken together parade-worthy? No, it is not. Does it signal hope that the GOP isn't in a death grip of disinformation and obstruction? No, it does not. But regardless of the fear-mongering and the grievance-fueled politics of much of the GOP these days, the glimmers of progress on multiple fronts on the Biden agenda is something, and it's the product of a president who has stayed in the bipartisanship game in the face of very little from the GOP. And it just might be about to pay off. Bipartisan progress is where we start this hour. Joining me live on set, I haven't said that for 16 months, MSNBC political analyst, the former Senator Claire McCaskill is here. Thank you so much for being here.
Can I just say how good it is to
actually see you?
I wanted a cake,
and I want to reach out and hug you.
I should have a cake here.
I know, we should always have a cake here. It was actually hard to zip in, no cake. And Harry Litman is also here, former U.S. Attorney, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. Cake or no cake?
Jason, we wish you were here, too, at this table, but better remote than not with us at all. You better be. Politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University and a contributor to both MSNBC and The Griot. And Phil, we're going to put you on the spot to come back to the table. We have spots for both of you. Washington Post, senior Washington Post.
I want to be there.
We miss you. You can bring the dog. Things are going to be different after the pandemic. You can bring your cake. You can bring your dog. Everyone can wear sweatpants. Phil Rucker, of course, also an MSNBC political analyst. Jason Johnson, I'm coming to you, and you know why. I've seen your tweets. I think you see this as, you know, good but not good enough. Take me into your views on Juneteenth becoming a national holiday.
Look, it is a good idea for the United States to actually commemorate things that happen to black people. And it is telling that the last two new holidays that we had were MLK Day and Juneteenth. These things are nice. These things are good. But I have to say that the fact that this passed unanimously in a Senate, the same Senate that has supported sort of white nationalists by not wanting an investigation into June 6th, the same Senate where half the senators don't want to do anything about voting reform, it says something about how much or what difference this holiday really makes, okay? You know, Josh Hawley and Mitch McConnell are not voting for Juneteenth because they think it does any good for black people, because they think it does any healing for America. They vote for it because they know it won't do anything. So while I respect the intentions of people who wanted this holiday, and I don't think it's a bad thing, I think it's a good discussion. I think that it's a pushback on all these crazy arguments about critical race theory, because I will tell you, as an adult black person, I didn't learn about Juneteenth until I was in college. So bare minimum, having this holiday requires kids to learn more about history than they knew before. I just hope that it is followed up by actual policy, and we're not fooled into thinking that the fact that it could pass unanimously in the Senate means that these senators are remotely interested in making the kind of multiracial democracy that we actually want to see one day.
And on the sort of signs of life for the police reform legislation being sort of hammered out between Senator Cory Booker and Senator Tim Scott, as well as the compromise voting reform that Manchin has floated, where are you on those, Jason?
So as far as Booker and Tim Scott going, I don't have a lot of confidence in where police reform is going to end up. I think at best at this point, given the resistance from the Republicans, we'll get a big old database of this is where people are getting killed. Is that progress? Yes. But if the database cannot be used to enforce consent decrees and actual change in behavior and eliminate some of these departments and replace them, I don't know that that does any good. As far as Manchin, this is progress. This is absolutely progress. I am thrilled because after all of this time, now we actually know what he wants. We can negotiate. The problem that I always had with Manchin, and to a lesser extent Sinema, is he kept complaining about what he didn't like. It's the guy who's like, I don't want Italian, I don't want Chinese, I don't want Indian tonight. Well, dude, where do you want to go to dinner? Well, now we know. And so now real negotiations can happen. So I think Manchin's This is a good step forward for everybody.
It is a high bar for Jason Johnson to give a good review. I'm sort of in shock. But
Jason, are you okay?
But
I know. I'm just like, I got to check my head. Am I all right?
No, but it is a breakthrough. I mean, Manchin has played the role of a spoiler around this. And to actually be someone putting something out there is a big step.
Yeah, I think what's important to remember here is how the internal workings of the Senate are playing out. You know, I made the analogy that what Chuck Schumer wants to do is get everybody on one side of the room together. Well, he had kind of done that, and there was only one guy on the other side of the room. So that group on that one side of the room, they are the ones that were putting pressure on Joe Manchin to come with something. He sent his proposals to the members, not to Chuck Schumer, not to activists, not to the civil rights groups, but to his fellow colleagues in the Democratic caucus. He was signaling to them, hey, I'm with you on early voting. I'm with you on making the election day a holiday. I'm with you on some of this stuff. I just don't want public financing of campaigns and some of the other things that were in H.R. 1. So Jason's right. Now the negotiations begin. And the question is, and this is where Joe Manchin still has a lot of pressure, can he bring any Republicans?
Well, and I think that what has become clear, and it has taken all of us as a media, and I think we've learned from the state media, the state reporters writing on these laws, it's taken a long time to really understand the most insidious aspects of these laws. They're in multiple buckets. One is disempowering the few election officials who sort of walk the line, Democratic and Republican election officials. But now in the case of Raffensperger, you know, Trump is cheering him today for rushing through and supporting this voter suppression law. What does the Manchin bill do to protect against those sort of dismantling the kinds of people that decide about elections? And then what does it do in the actual bucket of the egregious voter suppression and disenfranchisement?
Yeah, I think this really is a move forward, and it's a parade worthy. It might be a little parade, but look, the important thing, and I think this is what Stacey Abrams is thinking about, is federal law trumps state law. So the Manchin bill says, first, speaking of federal holidays, Election Day would be a federal holiday. Everybody could vote. That's always been a big problem. Absentee ballots for 15 days. Tries to do something with gerrymandering. Tries to do something. Motor voter is basically in there. That's a lot, and it could edge forward, and this from a guy who seemed to be staying on the sidelines and doing nothing. So I think it's a pretty big step forward, and the main point is, if were it to pass, anything in state laws, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, that is inconsistent with it, goes by the board. So some of the nastiest stuff becomes null and void in a stroke. That's what matters the most. I think you've got to keep your eye on combating the movement in the states as much as passing a full-bodied bill for voting rights.
I want to make sure I understand that. So any federal voting rights legislation wipes out all of these state bills?
It preempts it. Article 6. You know,
so nerdy.
Exactly. I love being here. You can't have federal law, state law that's inconsistent. If they say 15 days absentee and these guys want to say sorry, forget about it. So the provisions that it actually enacts as a matter of federal law, it defeats, it occupies the field in state law. That's, I think, the big ticket item here.
So, Phil Rucker, that certainly changes the politics of all this. And I think it's exasperating that Joe Manchin has the power that he has. But to Jason's point, something from Manchin that he could support is a million times over better than nothing, than no federal legislation.
That's exactly right, Nicole. This is a big step forward for voting rights because, look, it's been several months now that we've had discussions on Capitol Hill about what to do here, and Manchin had not moved. And the numbers just weren't there to add up in the Senate, at least, to support the bill that long ago had already passed the House. And things were effectively at a stalemate. And what you had in President Biden and his team at the White House were people willing to be patient. They waited week after week to try to see something come together, to try to bring Manchin to the table, to try to perhaps get some bipartisan support from across the aisle. And now you're starting to see those glimmers of hope that you described in the opening commentary. And, you know, we'll see if this ends up passing and how quickly and what that actually looks like at the end. But for Manchin to put his cards on the table like this is indeed a step forward from where the discussion had been just yesterday.
I want to get you on the record with understanding why this overwhelmingly conservative Supreme Court ruled as it did. But I want to come back to this idea of I've called it the Biden doctrine. And it's my understanding from talking to his most senior aides that his strategy and the way he sort of effortlessly stayed out of the insurrection, stays out of all the noise, is that their bet on their own political health is on outputs, deliverables. Their bet is that if we can get stuff done, we will take that to the voters. We'll hand it to, you know, our allies in Congress in the midterms, and that's what we'll take to the voters in 4 years. And I just want to spend a minute on the bipartisanship because my friend Jason Johnson hasn't been a super fan of the bipartisan approach, and there are a lot of critics, frankly, who think that the Republicans aren't negotiating in good faith, and they're not. But let me read some of this from New York Magazine about what they describe as a stealth strategy for getting big things done, even with a split Senate. Biden has been encouraging the second wave of bipartisan infrastructure talks, even though some powerful progressive Democrats refuse to support them. He and his aides are quick to point out that they're doing whatever they can unilaterally to clean up Trump's messes inside federal agencies and abroad, while now distributing vaccines around the world and negotiating new global minimum tax rates. Even on the Hill, they like to note there's been progress on important matters, competitiveness with China, water infrastructure, that just don't get top billing. To those around Biden, the drumbeat to speed up his high-profile legislative calendar is a product of analysts and progressives' skewed sense of normalcy. These things take time.
Yeah, they do take time. And what you're seeing now, and Mitch McConnell has to be getting a little worried, when you have as many Republicans breaking publicly for this infrastructure bill, it's not clear that McConnell signed off on it. And you've got 11 Republicans. That's 10 you need plus one more to actually pass a major infrastructure bill without reconciliation. That's a big bleep deal, as my friend Nicole Wallace would say, usually in my ear instead of in person. It is a big bleep deal.
Yeah.
And so what is going to happen here is these Republicans that are joining this infrastructure bill, they're from states where Democrats can also get elected. So, you know, the shoe's on the other foot. We've all been focused on the Manchin shoe and the cinnamon shoe and the Mark Kelly and the Democrats that are in tough states for Democrats. There's Republicans that are in tough states. So they want to be seen as working across the aisle and getting things done. So patience may pay off here, and they still have that very important weapon of reconciliation in their pocket. So they can get this deal done and still work with Manchin to try to get 50 on another deal that might do some of the things on daycare and elder care.
The bolder
that
things.
would be a big deliverable for Joe Biden in the midterms.
Jason, I invoked you, so I want to bring you back in on this. Where is your advice on this, on navigating sort of the policy imperative, obviously, but also the politics of delivering? I mean, the first one was really easy to understand: needles in arms, money so schools could open safely in the spring and summer and fall. That gets a little more difficult when these are sort of long wished for to-dos, especially things that languish over the last 4 years. What's your read? What's your advice for this White House?
If we were like in a parliamentary system and Biden called an election right now, all he'd have to do is say, did you get a shot and a check, right? Like,
right.
If you got these two things, he's doing a fantastic job. Going forward, what is very important, and I think this is really key so people don't get too excited too quickly about what Joe Manchin has just done, you cannot look like you are compromising or you're sacrificing the rights of your constituents in order to just get something done, in order to just get points on the board. There are well-meaning forces within the voting rights movement who are not happy with what Joe Manchin has suggested, who are really concerned about what he's saying about federalizing the idea of having to have additional ID, the idea of motor voter, but there's also opt-out. Does that mean states can opt out? Does that mean that states can still continue to purge? There are some real questions here. And so the Biden team has to be very careful going forward to not say, look, be quiet. We just want to get something done. Look, if I don't want, and this is the Senate version, nobody wants to have a John Lewis Voting Rights Act pass, right, that doesn't do anything for Voting Rights Act. That's like passing a George Floyd Blue Lives Matter bill, right? It does the opposite of the person that it supposedly represents. So that's the political risk going forward. You can't just get excited about getting something done if it doesn't provide the deliverables to the constituents who have been asking you for it from the beginning. You know,
Phil Rucker, my sense, and you'll know better than me, is that if you look at who is in charge of threading that needle, and that is exactly what Jason Johnson just described, my sense is that it's the president himself, that it is his commitment to bipartisanship, his reverence for the traditions of the Senate that sort of drive that. Could you fill in that picture for us? Is that right? He's the one driving, sort of keeping the big agenda items in sight, but also keeping bipartisanship alive?
It certainly appears to be the case, Nicole, because let's keep in mind who Joe Biden is, who President Biden is. He was in the Senate for so many years at a time when bipartisanship was the norm in the Senate, and he was used to working across the aisle and developing the sorts of relationships and coming up with deals and consensus. He was never, on the left in the Senate. He was very much a man kind of in that middle, working to build bridges. And that's the way he campaigned to become president. And it's very important to him that his presidency is seen as bipartisan. And let's also keep in mind what he's withstood these last several months. There's been a lot of pressure on him from more progressives in the Democratic Party who have wanted him to act quickly and to use reconciliation to pass big ticket items with Democratic votes, to take advantage of the political momentum he has had this spring with his popularity and with the popularity of his policy proposals. And he has instead been patient and tried to wait to negotiate with Republicans. For weeks, it was with Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. Now you're seeing Manchin play an even bigger role here on infrastructure with a different group of Republican senators. But it's important to Biden, first and foremost, that he at least do everything he can to have this be a bipartisan consensus before ramming anything through with Democrats.
And it is a big gamble. I mean, you're betting that the public values bipartisanship more than they value big ticket transformational items. It's a debatable one. I'm sure it's hotly debated inside the West Wing. I want to come back to you on what happened today. How does the supermajority conservative Supreme Court vote again to preserve Obamacare?
Right. And I do want to just cast my vote with what Phil said. I mean, I do think it's an administration that believes that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and their brief's going to be, we're doing stuff. We are, with respect to Jason, putting points on the board, and look what the other side is doing. But speaking of the other side, the super conservative Supreme Court, once again, it comes June and everyone's hunkered down expecting the sky to fall, and it doesn't quite happen. Not because I think they're not a super conservative majority, but John Roberts, of all people, I think was able to usher a sort of medium path in two cases. So the first, the ACA, I think really now it's done. 3 strikes are out. They've tried once, twice, 3 times. And it's interesting because it was a conservative doctrine that carried the day. That doctrine is you can't come to court unless the court can do something for you. Don't just come because you don't like something. And after the Republicans had taken that tax that Roberts had called a penalty and made it 0, there's nothing for a court to do. So there's all we can do is impose 0. That's nothing. That means we can't help you. Goodbye. Clarence Thomas says, I don't like the ACA, but we have to do standing first. So there's a kind of irony that it's the big conservative doctrine that keeps them out. Even more on Fulton. I don't know if you want me to move to that, but
Go ahead.
so very quickly, that was the one I think everyone really was waiting with bated breath because the new supermajority on the court seems very receptive and solicitous of free exercise rights. And it looked like it was going to be occasion for overruling a really important principle, which is if you're just acting neutrally and not singling out religion, you can do it, and we thought that there were going to be people, in fact there were, in dissent saying you should have overturned it. But Roberts was able to cobble together progressives and others to say, you know what, they did discriminate here. Why? Because Philadelphia is able to make exceptions. So that means they can say yes, no, maybe not, balls and strikes. And so when they tell the Catholic organization, we won't let you participate because you won't allow same-sex parents, they really were, in the court's analysis, singling them out. So they don't have to touch old doctrine. They can just say this is good old-fashioned discrimination, and that falls without going any further in the law.
Really quick question. I mean, you mentioned Roberts twice. Now, hope is the gateway to despair, but is it irrational to hope? You talked about him persuading his fellow jurists. Is he going to play that kind of role? And do you think that he could persuade conservatives to side with the liberals in some instances?
Maybe, but everyone thought he had been sidelined, and it's the role of the Chief Justice to sometimes be with the libs, sometimes be with the conservatives. He did it here. A secondary storyline here is the return of Roberts from the dead, where he'd been called irrelevant. So it's, I think, a real sign that the Roberts court is back in business.
All right, we'll keep watching. Jason Johnson, Phil Rucker, thank you both so much for starting us off. Next time, your seats at the table will be here. Claire and Harry aren't going anywhere.
It's nice here.
We're never going to let you leave. They'll be here all day, every day.